I'm Ashley Gordon.
And I'm Kirk Kernett.
And welcome to Reading for the Rest of Us.
This is our Dog Days of Summer episode.
It is. See, we're dressed for the weather.
That's right.
You can tell.
So, Ashley, you heard any big literary news lately?
Well, I heard that there was a manuscript found, and it had been hidden for many, many years, and much to the delight of fans of Dr. Seuss, it was recently published.
That's right, but we're not going to talk about Dr. Seuss until
But that's
a little
true.
bit.
It
but
did
it is
just
true.
happen.
What's the book called? I Want a Pet, You Bet, or something
Yeah,
like that?
yeah, or What's My Pet?
What's My Pet, yeah.
I think. Sorry.
But we are, of course, going to talk today about the publication, some 55 years in the making, supposedly,
Yes.
of Harper Lee's Go Set a Watchman, which has really, I think, rewritten the map of reading for the summer of 2015. It's an amazing thing to bear witness to.
Well, it certainly took it over, and everybody had an opinion on it, which
Sure.
is also one of the more fascinating things, that this book, just a single book by a woman from a tiny town in South Alabama, and the entire literary world, at least the English-speaking part of it, sort of comes to a standstill.
It's really a testament to the power of To Kill a Mockingbird, because really this is not necessarily an unusual thing. There are 3 versions of Lady Chatterley's Lover out there.
Which part's not unusual? That there would be
that they would publish a manuscript.
Okay.
Usually it's done after the author has passed away.
Posthumously, okay.
But you know, the Hemingway estate is for 45 years published unfinished books of his. There's a version of The Great Gatsby that's out there, an early version with very modest differences that was published about 15 years ago. So
Did they tell anybody?
yeah, but it wasn't headline news. It didn't stop up everybody's news feed, and that, I think, is a testament to the value that people put onto Kill a Mockingbird, but I also think it's a testament to the sort of intrigue with Harper Lee and the low profile.
It has so many elements to it. The fact that she is still living, and they kept calling her a recluse, which I found irritating.
Yeah.
It's not as if she was hiding. The number of people who would see her out regularly, she didn't want to talk to the press,
Sure.
Which is different from being reclusive. It's maybe being selective in who you hang out with.
Yeah.
But also, I wonder if one of the significant differences in maybe the examples that you cited and the phenomena around this one, which to some degree was manufactured, of course. We have to give credit to all the publicity people who helped do this. But the movie and the book are so closely intertwined, and Gregory Peck as Atticus is one of those images that so many people grew up with.
Yeah.
Whereas the other books you mentioned, yes, there are 2 Great Gatsby movies, but neither of them were ones that just that people automatically have in their top 10 of all-time movies. So how much do you think the movie and people's, I wonder, some of the people freaking out about the book if they'd even read To Kill a Mockingbird?
Well, that's a good question, and I thought it was interesting that down in the real-life Macomb, down in Monroeville, which is only about 100 miles from where we are, that the world's only Gregory Peck impersonator showed up dressed
Seriously?
as Atticus, yes.
Wow,
And,
what a distinction to be the only one.
Well, apparently he does pretty well at it. And he talked about the different film roles that he does, but he said Atticus is by far his most popular role. But I do think people, and certainly people, I think of the baby boomer generation and our generation, those of us who were born either during the Civil Rights Movement or afterwards, have an incredible investment in Atticus Finch, because really I think that that character remains one of the, or maybe up until now was one of the few uncompromised really heroes that people had. The people kept going, oh, people name their kids after Atticus. How are they supposed to
Scout.
deal with this now?
Well, who was the Bruce Willis and Demi Moore?
Right. They have a daughter named Scout.
They were, in the true sense of the word, iconic.
Sure.
But so you made a point that's been bothering me, actually, about this whole drama around Atticus. And obviously, in case you've missed it, we are referring to the frankly racist characterization of Atticus in Go Set a Watchman that is quite divergent from the character we came to know in To Kill a Mockingbird. So, and you talked about, how did you say it, unsullied hero, or sort of
uncompromised.
Uncompromised, thank you. Why is it that we expect our heroes to be pure?
Yeah.
And how unrealistic is that?
It's a very American thing. I mean, you think about the whole sort of situation in To Kill a Mockingbird where you have one man stand up to the mob. And, you know, that's really I think when we were first starting to read literature, it was always either man versus nature, man versus himself, or man versus man. And that was kind of the elemental man versus man motif, was one person escaping the conformity or the sort of injustices of society. So I think that plays a part in it. But I also think it's a longing on the part of those of us who, first read that book as children, whose ideas of racial harmony have since been challenged in all kinds of ways.
But something we longed for.
Sure. It's a dream. It's a wish. I will say that one of the interesting things that has come about in a lot of these reviews, I don't think it's a reassessment of Atticus, because there's been a strain of this all throughout the reception history of To Kill a Mockingbird. But there is a notion that what many of us see as Atticus's sense of justice can be interpreted as a sort of benevolent racism, or
and could have been, frankly, before this book was
Sure,
published.
sure.
If you read To Kill a Mockingbird very closely, you saw Atticus reveal his true feelings, which are exacerbated in Go Set a Watchman, but he was hardly the visionary progressive in the book that he has been. It's as if the character took on a life of its own and came outside of the book, even beyond the movie to some degree.
No, I agree completely.
And there was this does not originate with me, there was actually an article in a law review some 15 years ago.
Yeah, very famous article.
That
about
took
whether
this
he
apart.
was a good lawyer or not.
And people were mostly just dismissed it because, no, we want Atticus to be pure.
Right.
So I do think it calls into question our desire for purity, because if you look at Atticus and his true feelings, the fact that he did stand up to the mob, that he did fight for social justice, without that purity almost makes it more compelling, because he wasn't a true believer. He hadn't drunk any Kool-Aid. He just thought everyone deserves a fair defense. Now, as he evolves, he's even less of a fighter than we came to believe he was. But
it really brings up some issues that if you either are a fan of Harper Lee's, or if you teach To Kill a Mockingbird, how do you approach this book? I mean, to me, it's almost impossible to read this. I've seen Set a Watchman referred to as a sequel, but
it's a prequel.
Exactly. To read it as a sequel, you have to read it chronologically within the world of that fiction.
But she didn't write it that way.
Well, and that's the problem.
How much does it matter? I'm interrupting you completely, but how much does it matter of the author's intent? Because she didn't write them in 1-2 order. And also, how much of Atticus is hers and how much is he ours? It's as if the readers, this collective group of readers, took Atticus and made him something that he wasn't, made him what we wanted him to be. And she never possibly intended for him to be. So does the author own the character, or do we own the characters? And when did it shift? When did we become this self-righteous group of, no, you cannot do that to our Atticus? Well, when did he become ours and not Harper Lee's?
Well, I think in some ways it's an unanswerable question. I think that question probably goes back to the movie, like we were saying a little bit ago, that you have a movie that is so iconic, and that think of just what happened in the time space between 1960 when To Kill a Mockingbird was published, and 1962 when the movie came out. You could feel, I think, in those cultural moments, or you can see, if you look at the chronology of the civil rights movement, you can feel almost this inexorable push that there is going to be a change. And I think that movie, for many white quasi-liberals, you know, really
It was proof.
catalyzed that.
Yeah.
So I think that's one answer. But to go back to this question about readers, I think it's fascinating to me to sort of look at how different reviewers or commentators are reading the book, whether they do choose to read it chronologically as a sequel, or whether they look at the composition history of the book and recognize that it is a sense of first draft or a first go at a work that, you know, we can argue, should it have been published at all? I mean, that's a big strain of the debate.
Oh, I don't even like that argument.
Well,
it was published, and
yeah.
it wasn't up to us. I also found that really interesting.
Do you think the presence of this book will forever change how people read To Kill a Mockingbird? Because that's one of the arguments out there that people are making about the book.
Well, first of all, I don't think it will, because I think so many people will read To Kill a Mockingbird because it's assigned in school and they'll never make it to Go Set a Watchman. I do not think this intense attention will continue. It just can't. It will burn itself out. On the other hand, what I would hope would happen, because probably these will be taught in the same courses, you know, there will be some teachers who want to do them side by side, because they do invite such an intense feeling, and how wonderful is that to have nations sort of stop and discuss a book, and a really, regardless of whether you think it's To Kill a Mockingbird or not, it was still a very good book.
Sure.
And there were some moments in it that I just found so delightful, and I frankly am so pleased that it was published, because I think it makes, I think together they bring a gravity to Kill a Mockingbird that maybe wasn't there, because they do show Atticus as a person of his time, and she was writing it at the point when all of that was happening. I mean, you were talking about what was going on from 1960 to 1962, from the time the book was published to Kill a Mockingbird to when the movie was made. So think about what Harper Lee would have been feeling, because if she wrote Go Set a Watchman first, she was grappling with that Atticus, this racist Atticus.
And that's the 1957 Atticus of the Montgomery bus boycotts and the Citizens Council, which I thought was a very interesting presence in this book.
So that was something she was dealing with in real life at the time when she was writing that book. So she's just written Go Set a Watchman. Then she spends a year intensely rewriting to create To Kill a Mockingbird, then watches it become a movie. So the Atticus that she struggled with in movie form becomes the Atticus she wanted him to be. Isn't that interesting to think, to go back and think of all this happening in a contemporary sense? And that's one of the other things that's so interesting about this book. It wasn't written now looking back 60 years. It was written then. And so we're reading it through this filter, but she wasn't writing it through that filter.
It also makes me wonder if this book were not published in what have been the past 2 or 3 years of a very intense, fraught racial debate in America, where we've seen all kinds of instances of the idea that our nostalgia for the civil rights movement is perhaps premature.
The anniversary of the walk across the bridge in Selma, that is being juxtaposed against Black Lives Matter. So this is an intense discussion we're having right now when this book comes out. And one of our heroes is he being dismantled, or is he being given texture and context that make him all the more remarkable?
It makes me wonder how, and this, I don't mean this to sound snobby, but I think it makes me wonder how readers who don't necessarily approach a book academically or from a historical perspective are really dealing with these conversations about race in the book, because I think on the one hand you can sit there as a reader and say, okay, this conversation was timely at the time it was written. You know, they're dealing with the citizens.
It's an objective distance.
You ask most people today what were the white citizens' councils. We have no cultural memory of those, really. They're almost like a footnote to that whole conversation.
Is that intentional?
But
we whitewashed it,
well, I do think in some ways we've congratulated ourselves for
prematurely.
and I also think that, but I also think from an artistic perspective, it's incredibly difficult to pull off a political conversation. Even if we were to write a novel today that's taking place at the politics of the moment, if we were to write the great American novel about Obama, how is that conversation going to have some spark of life or some sort of interest 50 years from now? We could go back and look at political novels that came out in the late 50s that deal with race. Does anybody really read Black Like Me anymore, or is that a historical artifact? Most of the books that I can think of, like Ralph Waldo Ellison's Invisible Man, they are so self-consciously literary in their technique or form or style that that's really kind of what in some ways sustains interest in them, as opposed to, well, what was going on
the
politically
political
in the
components.
book. Yeah.
That's really interesting, because this falls into none of those categories.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess she was writing a political novel of sorts around a young woman's experience,
Sure,
making
sure.
it political from a very personal perspective. So I wonder if 50 years from now it will be read as an artifact.
Yeah. Well, I do think, and I will say this, I think eventually this will be kind of a footnote to To Kill a Mockingbird. I agree completely. It baffles me that people claim that nobody will ever be able to read To Kill a Mockingbird the same way again. I mean, you know, our ability to forget things or to seize upon the reality that we want, I think in this case is a positive thing, because we can go back. And again, I'm always struck by the fact that for many of us, our first experience of To Kill a Mockingbird is in childhood. And I think that, you know, you often see To Kill a Mockingbird put down by some of the more snobby people as a children's book.
Yeah.
But, you know, we need to understand that there's an appeal for that experience. I mean, who among us doesn't want, you know, some ethically...
Well, clearly we were not alone in that, because of this desire to hold on to Atticus.
Sure.
There was a Diane Rehm conversation, one of the Diane Rehm shows was all about this before the book came out, and there was some disdain for To Kill a Mockingbird as a children's book, and I was working and listening to it in the background, but that immediately brought me to, okay, I have to respond.
Mm-hmm.
What is wrong with a book that gives us hope? What is wrong with a book that shows us? And they were criticizing it for its lack of realism, that it did give us sort of a fairy tale experience around race relations, but it showed us what we wanted to be.
And I think that's one way in which writing a book in 1958 to 1960, but looking back, gives it that sort of space of time where you can...
It's kind of sepia tinge.
Yeah, exactly. You can take it out of the present moment. And we as readers can take it out of the present moment. I mean, most people I know that read To Kill a Mockingbird, they don't even necessarily... I know teenagers who read it who think of it as being set in the 50s, because to them the 50s is as ancient
far back
as
as
the
they
30s.
can go.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think it's, you know, again, I'm struck by the sort of historical elements of the book that really force us to read Watchmen as a document of the late 50s, of its time.
And it's got some wonderful moments of just clarity.
Yeah.
And it also struck me, more so than I remember To Kill a Mockingbird. I did not go back and read To Kill a Mockingbird before this one, and it's been a really long time since I've either seen the movie or read the book, and it allowed me to read Go Set a Watchman somewhat outside of all that context. I was just reading it as a book, and did I like it or not, and what merits did I find in it? And I did really enjoy it, I have to say. But part of what struck me about Go Set a Watchman there were some elements that were so intrinsically Alabama.
Yeah.
And I wondered if, had it been edited, some of those would have been lost. Because I would read a passage and think, would anybody now even know what that means?
Yeah.
Referencing a cousin as having characteristics like a $3 bill.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I know what that means,
Sure.
but I'm sure my children have no idea what that means.
Yeah.
And I learned it from grandparents.
Right.
And there were other aspects of the book that were just very reflective of
Yeah.
Monroeville, of growing up in a small Alabama town.
Well,
and I found that very charming.
I agree. I think it has that sort of, there are passages in there, and of course there are elements that she took straight from this manuscript
And lifted whole, yeah.
put into. You know, and it's interesting that people, you know, reviewers have pointed that out, like somehow that's amazing or, you know, bizarre or something. But, you know, that if you ask most writers and you look at most writers' drafts, I think you discover those things carry over. I do think we need to acknowledge that part of what makes people uncomfortable with this whole question of whether the book should have been published is the issue of her health, and that's a very sensitive issue. You know, and again, we're dealing with this. This is not necessarily a new situation. I mean, I think estates of authors always get accused when they begin going back through the archive and rediscovering
exploiting them and
exactly
damaging their literary merit. Or
and I think that, you know, you sometimes see the argument in some of these reviews that said, well, if they had waited until she passed away, and if they had done it as a scholarly edition, as opposed to,
you know how many people would have read it then?
Well, I know, and that's
and
really.
look at what's happening and how, like we were talking about this. I don't think I've said this on air yet. The idea of Waterstones in London tweeting out the pictures of lines of people at midnight waiting to get their book.
And I think that's what these reviewers are objecting to, is that they're that somehow. You know, it's the whole business angle to it that I think people
find distasteful.
If that's the right word, exploitative, being engineered into an event. But again, if there weren't this investment in that novel and in,
you can't engineer people to stand in line at midnight in another country.
And there, you know, the publishing industry is rife with books that were supposed to be events
that weren't,
and just fizzled out. So.
Yeah, so publishing actually, that's one of the sort of tenets of publishing, is that you think you've picked out this bestseller and you totally didn't. And often, one of the ones that was often used when I was coming up in publishing was Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Was supposed to be a disaster and was published like, please, I'll publish it if you'll leave me alone. And then it becomes one of the best-selling books of all time as of maybe 20 years ago. So publishers are notorious for thinking they can make a hit and then it not happening and being surprised by one, like the whole 50 Shades of Grey.
Well, we ought to mention that, you know, it was announced this week that Go Set a Watchman has sold 1.1 million copies, and in fact, the only other book that's come anywhere near that this year or in any recent year is E.L. James' Grey, which is the sequel to
I mean, talk
50
about
Shades of Grey.
Mining your own material. Here, I'll just rewrite the same book I already wrote, but from a different perspective. So kind of interesting.
Here's an interesting thought. How many of these 1.1 million readers bought both books?
To Kill a Mockingbird or Grey?
No.
Well, To Kill a Mockingbird sales have gone through the roof.
But how many are the same people that bought Grey and bought Go Set a Watchman?
I couldn't begin to answer that question because I have no idea why you would buy one of those Grey books. I admit it. I'm sorry, I'm a snob.
Well, I think it'd be fascinating. If anybody out there is one of those people, let us know, because we'd love to interview you.
Well, I heard today on the radio a Democrat that is intrigued by Trump. So you know what? People are crossing lines left and right.
And I do think that at some level, you know, you know, the mass majority of readers, I think, probably want to participate in these events because it does feel like a historical moment. I mean, we've had essentially 55 years of silence. Now, I will say that if the sort of hints and rumors of future books keep coming,
that does seem ridiculous.
You know,
like,
we're going to be dealing with diminishing returns as we go on.
Yeah, this won't happen with book, you know, found book number 2.
Right.
No.
But, you know, and I do think for the future of what we call Harper Lee studies, you know, or Southern literature studies, that, you know, having access to this material is very important for us to understand how To Kill a Mockingbird came to be the book that it is. I mean, one of the stories that's now going around, and unfortunately it's being used as a way, I think, to again undermine her artistry, when in fact this is a very common thing. Most writers are loath to admit this, but you know, the fact that, and collaboration isn't the right word.
Are you going to say Truman Capote?
No. That Truman Capote story
That's
is
a
the
total myth.
biggest
Yeah.
bunch of BS
Okay, sorry.
ever.
Didn't mean to
The
derail
fact
you.
that she wrote, not with the assistance, but with the sounding board of an editor who
yeah.
essentially read this manuscript, very famous editor, who read the manuscript, recognized what was great in it,
Right.
and said, this is what you need to focus on, contrast
So
on.
we owe a huge debt to Tay Hohoff
Yeah.
for reading Go Set a Watchman and recognizing that the Scout voice, that those vignettes, that the sort of set pieces
Right,
that come out
right.
of Go Set a Watchman, the wonderful scene around the fish pond
Yeah.
and Dill and the sheep, and she saw those because they sparkle with life
Yeah.
in a way that the contemporary scenes do not. And so,
And probably
thank you,
for
Ms.
many of the
Hohoff.
same reasons that we've
Yeah.
noted about the difficulty of writing the political scenes at that particular
But the
moment.
children are
Yeah.
so just delightful. So
I
yeah.
personally think one of the worst myths that has ever burdened authors or any artist is the myth of the solitary genius, because the reality is no piece of art is created in a vacuum, and there's always some level of collaboration, whether it's other musicians performing on a song or an editor who, you know, really helps you reshape the work, or a publisher who aims it toward a certain market or whatever. This notion that if you have the help of a great editor, that somehow you're a lesser writer. It's just, we've got to get beyond that and recognize, I think, the relationship between writers and editors more, because in a sense those are the types of relationships that you end up having with readers too. I mean,
and that would be the fascinating class,
Sure,
really,
sure.
to look at the role of editors in literary classics, and particularly now you have, here's the book before the editor,
Yeah.
and here's the book after,
Exactly.
and you can compare the passages that made it into the new book, and like you and I both caught some things in Go Set a Watchman that, you know, an editor would have fixed,
Right.
some continuity issues and some other things.
Yeah. You're not going to believe this.
We did the whole show. We didn't
We are-
intend to do the whole
we
show
are
just
out
on this
of
book.
time.
And there's so many things about it that we haven't said
we
yet
could
that I
do
really
a whole
wanted to
nother
talk
show,
about.
but
You just said whole nother.
it's been a well, I'm a Southern.
For everybody who thinks we're snobs, you can feel better
whole
now.
nother. But thank you again for doing this.
Oh,
It's
it was
a
so much
great
fun.
conversation, and we'd love to hear from you about your reactions.
We
to
would.
Go
We're
Set
on
a Watchman.
Facebook,
And,
reading for the rest of us.
We're going to do another show in a couple weeks, and we might just
Yeah.
kick off with some reader reaction to Go Set a Watchman.
Oh, that would be
So,
great, particularly if you are that reader who also bought E.L. James. We promise to take it very seriously.
we definitely get a hold of us. We'll take you out to lunch and have
That
a
would
long
be
conversation.
super fun.
So
right.
thank you again, and until next time, keep reading.